So today we are looking at Chapter 24, the Cold War. And this is a period where the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global power. And they don't do it through direct war, but through ideology, influence, and fear. That's why it's called a Cold War, because we never actually go to war with the Soviet Union. But as you're watching this, I want you to listen for these three things. What actually caused the Cold War? How did the U.S. try to stop communism? And how did fear of communism affect life at home? So let's start right after World War II. You have these big three that met during World War II. These were our allies. This is Winston Churchill, this is Roosevelt, and this is Stalin. And hopefully, as you all know, Roosevelt is going to pass away before the official end of the war. He passes away, I believe, in April of 1945, and the war officially comes to an end in August after we drop the bombs on Japan. So, but the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and of course, Great Britain had all been allies, but that relationship is going to quickly fall apart. Why? Well, because they had completely different visions of the world. The United States, we support capitalism and democracy, and the Soviet Union supports communism. So each side believed the other was trying to dominate the world. So at first you have leaders like Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin who managed to cooperate, but when Truman takes over upon the death of Roosevelt, things are going to change. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about two worlds here. In 1950 is when this came out. But here's the USSR, and kind of their sphere of influence is here, like looks kind of like fish fins to me. And then the United States, and our sphere of influence in the blue. This is Harry S. Truman, and this is Stalin. So Truman distrusted Stalin, and he took a much harder stance with him. So they had disagreements over Eastern Europe. Are those going to be communists, or are we going to open it up and let them have like democratic elections? You're going to read about that and kind of the flop that happened, especially when we talk about Poland. There's also a conflict over atomic weapons. We didn't realize that the Soviet Union had been creating their own, and they were very close to finishing and successfully testing an atomic weapon. And there's also just rising suspicion on both sides. And that tension is going to lead to a major shift in U.S. policy, and you're going to read more about the Truman Doctrine, but basically what it's stating is the U.S. would support countries fighting against communism anywhere in the world. So this first played out in Greece. So here's the Mediterranean for you. But first played out in Greece, where the U.S. sent money and military aid to stop perceived communist takeover. It's important to note that the U.S. often exaggerated the threat of communism in order to gain support. This was a perceived takeover. It was not factual. We didn't actually have proof showing that it was a communist takeover. So did the Soviet Union actually support the Greek rebels? No. So next is going to come the Marshall Plan, and this is a picture of the guy who created the plan. This is George Marshall. So instead of fighting communism with weapons, we are going to turn to an economic strategy. We're going to use money, and we're going to send billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. And you'll read about it. I think the final number is 13 billion is what we end up sending. We offer this to the Soviet Union as well, but look for why they don't want to. And here's some underlying context. They don't want to because with our money comes strings. Strings are always attached when you're going to receive money. And the Soviet Union didn't want to open up themselves to deeper probe by the United States. So you can see here, it shows how much money we sent in the countries that took us up on the Marshall Plan. So we could help rebuild their economies after World War II. But the Soviets, they see this as a threat, and they're not going to participate. And so this is called economic containment. This is when we are stopping communism through financial support. So now the Cold War, it hardens and becomes more intense and more global. And we see that with the Berlin airlift. So when the U.S., Britain, and France combined their zones into West Germany, Stalin responded by blocking access to Berlin. So what did the US do? Well, instead of war, because we didn't want to go back to war, we flew in supplies for almost a year, and this is known as the Berlin Airlift, and it showed the US would resist Soviet pressure, but avoid direct military conflict, excuse me. Also, we didn't have a separate Air Force until after World War II, so this is showing the might of our Air Force. And it's not just the US, other countries are going to join and help us with this airlift. It's not just US planes flying, but we are the one that does the most during this time. Then also in 1949, the US formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, and basically what they came up with is if you attack one country that's a member of NATO, it's an attack on all of us. And the Soviets responded with their own alliances. And also they had a response to the Marshall Plan as well. They had their own economic aid package, and then they're going to also form the Warsaw Pact. That's a, counter to NATO. And so this really marks the start of a divided world when you see on here NATO, founding members of NATO, and then those that join are blue and green, and then members of the Warsaw Pact. And this is where Churchill gives a speech, and he says an iron curtain has fallen over Europe, and he's talking about this line here. This is, all Soviet Union. This is all Warsaw Pact. It's not a literal iron curtain. It's metaphorical. So don't be like, oh, there's like this iron thing. No, there's not. It's just like a metaphorical iron curtain there. But what we also see, let me go back up just one really quickly. 1949, the Soviet Union had developed an atomic bomb. China's also going to become communist under their new leader, Mao. And so now the U.S. felt surrounded, and this led to a document called NSC-68, which called for a massive military buildup and global containment of communism. So it sounds like we're probably going to go back to war. And we do. This is where the Cold War turns into hot fighting, like a hot war, or a hot spot within the Cold War. So after World War II, Korea is divided. And you have South Korea and North Korea, and they're divided along the 38th parallel. North Korea is communist, and so they align themselves with the Soviet Union. And South Korea is non-communist, and so they lean more towards the U.S. and U.S. intervention, and the U.S. is going to step in under the United Nations when North Korea invades South Korea in 1950. And here are the leaders. This is Sung, this is Ri in South Korea. He's in North Korea. And then this is General MacArthur, really famous probably because of his pipe, but also during World War II. He's going to lead the troops in the Korean conflict. So this is not a declared war. It was called a police action. And we never actually declare war in Korea. He will lead U.S. troops under the guise of the United Nations, though. So anytime you see or hear about it, some people will refer to it as the Korean War, but really it's just called the Korean conflict. And at first, forces are going to push north, but then China is going to enter because this is the Chinese border, and they're going to help North Korea push back United Nations forces. So there is a stalemate ending near where the war started. And so the key takeaway from this is the goal shifted from winning to just, can we just contain communism? So shifting to what's happening at home. The Cold War didn't just happen overseas, it's going to shape U.S. life, especially in the 1950s. And we have the Second Red Scare, and Americans feared communist spies were inside the country, and the government's going to respond with loyalty investigations, surveillance, and blacklists in Hollywood, and you'll read more about these. Even people with different political views were targeted. People with different lifestyle choices, like homosexuals, are targeted as well, along with immigrants. And the fear reached its peak with this guy. This is Joseph McCarthy, and he claimed that there were hundreds of communists working in the U.S. government, but he didn't actually have evidence. And still his accusations ruined lives and careers of many people. Eventually he's exposed during televised hearings, and he loses all of his credibility. It's kind of like at the end, I love this picture because of this guy's like, I've had it, this is enough. And that's pretty much what the U.S. public is going to be like once he goes on television and just completely loses control. But what we see is fear plus media attention that can lead to a powerful political weapon. So now the Cold War, it's also going to spread across the globe. And under President Eisenhower, the U.S. focused on nuclear weapons. And this led to brinkmanship. And that was pushing situations to the brink or to the edge of war. Then also mutually assured destruction or MAD. Both sides could destroy each other at any time because they both now have atomic weapons to do so. The goal wasn't to use nuclear weapons, but just to threaten with them. So after World War II, we're going to see some decolonization happening during the Cold War as well. And it depends, you'll see here with this map, these areas that are in orange, it's because they had intervention from the Soviet Union. These countries in yellow, they're going to have intervention from the United States. And so their alliances are going to be with whichever country helped them in their decolonization efforts. So many countries in like Asia, Africa, and a few in like Central South America gained their independence. And both the US and Soviet Union tried to very heavily influence these new nations. Many are going to wisely choose neutrality instead. But to stop interventions, to stop communism, the U.S. is going to create interventions. And they intervened in multiple countries. In Iran, there's the overthrow of a leader. In Guatemala, the CIA is going to back a coup. You will read about what's happening in Cuba and tensions with Fidel Castro. And then also there's conflict over the Suez Canal in Egypt. So not all of these governments were communist, but the U.S. acted anyway. So it's important to note that. Now, there are some that will lean towards communism like Cuba, and you'll notice how close Cuba is and why that is so scary for the United States, because it's right there off of our coast. And that will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we'll talk about that in later chapters. But also, finally, we become involved in Vietnam, and this is a major Cold War focus. So Vietnam is here. It kind of scoops around these other nations of Laos and Cambodia. It's this long, skinny nation on the coastline there. But after defeating France and winning their independence from France and kind of being, decolonizing from France, Vietnam is divided too, just like Korea was. And Vietnam is also divided into North and South. And in the North, it's under the communist leader Ho Chi Minh, and in the South, it's a U.S.-supported government. In the U.S., what we fear a domino effect, and this domino theory, if one country falls to communism, others will follow also. So we began supporting South Vietnam, really setting ourselves up for future conflict in this area. So the Cold War wasn't just about war. It was about ideology. It was about communism versus capitalism. It was fear and propaganda. It was global influence, decisions that still shape our world today. So the one thing I want you to think about is, did the United States act defensively or aggressively during the Cold War?